So, in the last video, I was criticizing Donald Trump and his attitude to the NHS. In this video, I'll be talking about his colleague, his counterpart to the north of the border in Ottawa, Mr. Justin Trudeau. Frankly, I'll just say this outright. I see Trump and Trudeau as two kind of extremes. On one hand, you have a real hard right in many ways, below hard. On the other hand, you have, and yeah, I do think Trump's a demagogue, but I've spoken at length about Trump. Trudeau, on the other hand, is an astonishingly naive, I don't know if even ultra liberal would be accurate, but just astonishingly naive, virtue signaling, reckless, in my opinion, leader who, but both these guys are, in my view, creating serious problems for their countries and in different ways. Trump is putting up walls, and Trudeau is tearing down walls, but to the point where it's just totally reckless. He's doing a Merkel in North America, basically. I think both of them have made some profoundly reckless decisions. But here's the thing, right? I don't want people to get the impression I'm telling Americans or Canadians who they should vote for or anything like that. But both countries are open. That's the premise of my argument here. Both countries are open. And I would say the Canadians who are defending Trudeau, if you're criticizing Trump and you're making constant comparisons, you have to be subject to criticism as well. Um, as for Britain and the NHS, I would say that outsiders are free to talk about our system, but they should get it right. Well, I want to comment on Justin Trudeau. Anyway, the premise of my argument is that any open democratic society should be just that and not fear outside opinions, right? So by all means defend your country if you think it's being misjudged, or your government or your leader, um, which is what I was doing with the NHS. I believe we were misjudged. I think it was inaccurate, um, and I think it's hypocritical as well. But I will say that the premise is that we're an open nation, right? Anyway, with the situation with Trudeau, I just want to talk about something because he was at some sort of town hall event. I assume it was in Ontario because the guy that posted the video was called Ontario Patriot or something like that. I don't know. Presumably conservative, but that's irrelevant. What matters is what was happening in the video, and Trudeau was addressing this town hall event, and this man got up and asked about his position on reinstating ISIS volunteers. So presumably that's Canadians who've went to fight for ISIS, or indeed people applying for immigration who had perhaps at one point been in ISIS. I don't know all the details of Trudeau's stance on this, but what he said in the response was really quite telling. Um, the man was asking about how can he reassure Canadians like himself that he will create a safe future for their children when he is with his attitude towards ISIS. Now, Trudeau's response was, I thought, utterly pathetic. What he basically said was, at any point in our history where there's been immigration, there's been some sort of backlash, and he actually compared ISIS fighters to Italian immigrants. This is not right wing propaganda. Trudeau directly said this. He said after World War II, there were Italian immigrants who came to Canada and they enriched our society, which is true, they did. They opened up Italian restaurants, they built communities, they married Canadians. They integrated in many ways into Canadian society. Maybe some didn't, but the point is they went there for a better life, and they went there because they saw Canada as a great nation, which it is. ISIS recruits, ISIS fighters have in many cases slaughtered people. They have mercilessly killed men, women, and children, Kurdish civilians. These are people who joined a hateful death cult. In many cases, of course, they say, "Oh, I didn't know what it was all about, and I just believed it was all Western propaganda, etc., etc." So they always have excuses. I believe that there's one of two things. It's either someone who joins his death cult really is astonishingly naive, in some cases might genuinely be mentally ill. There was a guy that Tommy Robinson confronted recently, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but the guy he confronted clearly was mentally ill. So therefore, they're volatile individuals. Someone who's mentally ill and who's expressing sympathies to a terrorist group should be sectioned under the Mental Health Act and whatever the Canadian equivalent is. Um, Clearly, they're potentially a dangerous individual. So, they're either openly sympathetic to this ideology, or they're mentally ill, or they are, as I claim, astonishingly naive. I think the last option is the least likely. I think that's a cop out. I think it's an excuse so they won't be prosecuted. In most cases, I don't believe that someone could be so stupid that they would genuinely believe that it was all anti-Western, Western propaganda against the beautiful, wonderful, tolerant religion of Islam and its political extremist wing, which is ISIS. Um, ISIS is Islamist. It's Islamic supremacy. That's fundamentally what it is. And I don't want to dominate this video by that whole debate, but that's my position. I believe you can't divorce ISIS from Islam. I appreciate a lot of people would disagree, but that's my stance. Regardless, Trudeau's answer was just so dismissive, downright insulting, and insulting to a lot of people. If I was an Italian immigrant in my 70s or 80s who'd grown up in Canada, I would feel angry by that statement. I'd feel, wait a second, are you comparing me? I've worked hard in this society, I've integrated, I've maybe married a Canadian woman or a Canadian man. You're comparing me to someone who joined a death cult? I mean, granted, Italy was an Axis power during World War II, at least for half of it, but many Italians opposed Mussolini. So I don't know if Trudeau was making some weak analogy there. But he didn't even attempt to reassure the man. He didn't even attempt to say something like, well, I understand your concerns. Terrorism is a real problem. In fact, if anything, his answer sounded to me like a borderline smear against the man because he was talking about a backlash against immigrants. So he was insinuating the man was being somehow bigoted. Trudeau's appalling. I mean, this is a guy who will virtue signal at every given opportunity, but seems to not really care about keeping his country safe, or at least not reassuring Canadians that that is what he is going to do. It's all very well talking about the diversity and the richness of immigration, but this is a guy who is giving the impression that he's just going to let in anybody without serious vetting. And he's clearly not learned from Merkel's experience in Germany, which was a major backlash, not so much against immigrants, although I'm sure that was part of it, but yes, against Angela Merkel personally. Even she has somewhat regretted that. She hasn't come right out and said it was a bad policy, but she has conceded that it caused a lot of anxiety, and with good cause. You don't allow 1 million people into a country en masse over a short period of time and not expect problems. You can be the most liberal person in the world and recognize that that is just stupid. Um, and it seems to me that Trudeau's trying to do the same thing in Canada. Now, Canada hasn't had the same level of Islamic extremism as European countries have had. And I think there's a few reasons for that. Geographically, it is further away from countries like Syria, where jihadists can easily go to and relatively easily come back. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's why France, for example, has had such a serious problem with Islamic extremism. We've had it in the UK. It's been a problem in Germany. The reason I think European countries get it more than the United States or Canada is not because, well, actually, if you think about it, Canada and the US have radically different approaches under Trump and Trudeau, and yet both countries have had problems with Islamism. So I think this is a problem that really is universal. Um, and I don't think the Trump approach is going to stop Islamic extremism because it won't stop homegrown Islamists. But likewise, the Trudeau response isn't going to stop it either because it's being willfully naive about the real threat of returning jihadists. I don't know all the details of Trudeau's policy, But this answer that he gave the man, at the very least, he could have reassured the guy. In the end, what he done was just he made a totally irrelevant point about Italian immigrants. The issue here isn't immigration, primarily. It's about being reckless with returning jihadists. And I don't know how any intelligent Canadian can rationally say that that isn't naive. I'm not talking about Trump supporters who want to put up a wall. I'm just talking about a basic degree of common sense. I'm not talking about being anti-immigration. Immigration can have many benefits. I'm not anti-immigration, okay? And I understand that Canada has a long tradition with this, but we live in a dangerous world, and for Trudeau to come out with the response that he did was just a disgrace. Now, like I say, I'm not telling Canadians how to think. I'm not telling Canadians what to do, but I do know that a lot of Canadians are getting increasingly fed up with this. Trudeau spends all his time virtue signaling to third wave feminists. Apparently, he reprimanded a woman today for using the expression mankind. This is a guy who seems far more determined to virtue signal and to pander to political correctness than to keep his country safe. I think that's a complete disgrace. And if I was a Canadian, I would be wanting this guy out of office because I think he's reckless. I think he is, he's very good at nodding to campaigning groups and so on. But I think the vast majority of Canadians are looking at him. I shouldn't say vast majority, okay. I shouldn't say that. But a lot of Canadians, I'll rephrase that, a lot of Canadians are looking at this guy and thinking he's playing games with our lives. For what? To virtue signal. Because Trudeau seems to think that criticizing ISIS is somehow attacking Muslims, but it's not. That's absurd. But Trudeau has a long track record of this. It's often brought up the time that he said we shouldn't call honor killings barbaric. Now, he did apologize, but I think that says something about the thinking of this guy. And in his own way, I would say Trudeau is just as much an extremist as Trump is, or at least just as much of an ideologue who is not thinking of realpolitik and thinking of what actually could work. So, yeah, I don't know. If I was a Canadian, I would be very concerned about this. I appreciate he has a hardcore group of supporters, just as Trump does. But ironically, in both situations, you have supporters who will, be really diehard in defending their man, defending their leader. I personally think both leaders are reckless. Trump is polarizing his country. He's constantly insulting allies. He's constantly conducting diplomacy by Twitter. And Trudeau is constantly virtue signaling at the price of common sense. Just my opinion.